At my father's 60th birthday dinner, he humiliated me in front of 30 relatives. Your sister married a hedge fund manager while you scoop dog poop. Mom even tossed me a $100 bill for a new scooper until my 78-year-old grandpa dropped his spoon and asked one question that left the entire room completely paralyzed. One daughter married Wall Street money. The other cleans up after mutts. My father raised his champagne flute, grinning like he was delivering a punchline. 30 relatives crowded the private dining room at the Oak Steakhouse. Every clinking glass stopped. He beamed at my older sister, Isabella. Look at her, stepping out of a Porsche. She built an empire. Then his gaze shifted to me. And then there's Claire. The ambient music faded away. Still picking up after neighborhood strays, kiddo? Uncle Marcus snickered into his prime rib. Second cousins chuckled nervously. I kept my hands gripped under the table. I run a legitimate business. I'm proud of my work. Business? My father dragged the word out. You had the exact same trust fund Isabella had. Same private tutors, and this is the path you stumbled down. My mother sighed heavily, looking at me like a tragic accident. Your father is just being honest. You threw your potential out the window. She unclasped her designer clutch and pulled out crisp cash. She tossed a $100 bill across the white linen tablecloth past the oysters, right onto my lap. I stared down at it. What exactly is this for? She actually smirked. Go buy yourself some decent waterproof boots. If you insist on walking dogs for a living, at least stop ruining our carpets. Uncle Marcus let out a loud laugh. Someone's husband coughed to hide his giggling. My chest tightened and my face flushed red. Not because of their jokes, but because these were the people who were supposed to support me. I placed the bill back on the table, sliding it away. Keep your money. My father threw his hands up, always playing the victim. Isabella just stared at her phone screen. She didn't laugh, but she never defended me either. I swallowed my anger and stayed silent, mostly because no one in that rented room knew a single fact about my reality. They only knew the narrative my father aggressively pushed. At every cocktail party, every golf game, one daughter secured a fortune, the other scoops poop. This year, he had an audience of 30 people. They had absolutely no idea why I bought a dilapidated kennel property 5 years ago. They didn't realize what I had spent the last 48 months quietly building, without ever asking a single person in this family for a dime. I gave up defending myself years ago. I was exhausted from trying to prove my worth to people who permanently labeled me a failure. But my father wasn't finished. He loved the sound of his own voice too much. We tried to pay for law school 3 separate times. She chose muddy paws and chew toys instead. Guess ambition skips a generation. Uncle Marcus chimed in. My mother tapped her manicured nail on the $100 bill, sliding it an inch closer. Take it, Claire, she insisted. Consider it a charity donation to your pet project. Charity. I looked at Benjamin Franklin's face and processed the sheer irony. What $100 meant to them. What it would have meant to me at 24, sleeping in a freezing animal shelter. And what it meant today. If they only had a fraction of a clue. Just pocket the cash, Claire. My father bellowed. Stop making a scene. Someone in this family has to live in the real world. And right at that moment, the entire dynamic of the room fractured. A sharp, piercing sound cut through the tension. The harsh clatter of a heavy silver spoon dropping against a porcelain saucer. Grandpa Elias, 78 years old, was sitting at the head of the long table behind a half-eaten bowl of soup. Everyone knew the unspoken rule. Grandpa never interfered, but he placed both his trembling hands flat on the mahogany table and slowly pushed himself to his feet. The whispering died instantly. He stared directly at my father, and when he finally opened his mouth, his voice carried an unmistakable authority. Before you embarrass your youngest daughter one more time in front of our flesh and blood, he turned his head, scanning the 30 faces staring back at him in shock. Why don't you explain to everyone who actually owns the corporate veterinary network that just bought out your entire investment portfolio? The silence was deafening. Nobody dared to inhale. Grandpa Elias waited a heavy beat, gripping the edge of the table. Then he delivered the brutal truth my father had spent the last 6 months praying nobody would uncover. Or, I will. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a physical weight in the room. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us. I could hear the ice shifting in Uncle Marcus's water glass. My father's mouth opened, shut, and opened again, like he was gasping for oxygen in a sudden vacuum. What are you talking about, Elias? My father finally managed to say. His voice was an octave too high. He forced a stiff, unnatural laugh that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. That's absurd. The wine's gone to your head. Grandpa Elias didn't blink. I haven't had a drop, Conrad, but you're going to need one. He leaned forward, bracing his weight on his knuckles. Tell them about Whitfield Partners. Tell them about the network of 24 regional animal hospitals that swallowed your prized real estate trust last Thursday. My mother, Margot, shifted uncomfortably. She looked at my father, her brow furrowed. Conrad? What is he talking about? You said a private equity firm from Seattle bought out the clinic leases. They did, my father snapped, the red flush of anger creeping up his neck. He glared at Grandpa Elias. It was a blind corporate acquisition, highly lucrative, handled completely by Duncan's team. He pointed a thick finger at my brother-in-law, Duncan, who was sitting next to Isabella. Duncan was a hedge fund manager. He was the golden boy. He was supposed to be the smartest guy in the room. But right now, Duncan looked like he had just swallowed glass. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his skin the color of old chalk. Duncan? Isabella nudged him. What is Elias talking about? Duncan slowly put his fork down. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at my father. He kept his eyes locked firmly on me. Claire, Duncan said, his voice barely a whisper. Whitfield Partners. That's not you. That's a massive holding company. The capital steel structure alone. I reached out and picked up the $100 bill my mother had tossed at me. I folded it in half, then in half again, creating a small, crisp square. I placed it gently next to my water glass. It started as a single kennel property, Duncan, I said. My voice was calm, completely level. I didn't feel the need to yell. The truth doesn't need to be shouted. The one Dad said was a money pit. I lived in the office for 14 months. I funneled every dollar back into the business. Then I bought a failing veterinary clinic in the next town over, flipped the management structure, retained the senior vets, gave them equity, and stabilized the cash flow. 2 years later, I bought 3 more. I looked directly at my father. The vein in his forehead was pulsing. By year 4, we had 16 locations. I continued, the words rolling out easily because I had lived every agonizing, exhausting second of them. I incorporated under Whitfield Partners to manage the acquisitions. When your real estate trust, the one holding the leases for a dozen independent clinics in the tri-state area, went underwater because you over-leveraged it on a bad commercial development, my board saw an opportunity. We bought your debt, Conrad. We bought your portfolio. For pennies, on the dollar. Liar, my father spat. He slammed his hand flat on the table, making the silverware jump. You're a dog walker. You scoop feces out of suburban backyards. I did, I replied evenly. 5 years ago. To pay for the down payment on the first commercial loan because you told the bank you wouldn't co-sign. The room was completely paralyzed. Uncle Marcus had physically leaned away from the table, as if proximity to my father would somehow contaminate him. My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle. Well, this is a very creative story, Claire, really, but let's not ruin your father's birthday with fantasies. It's not a fantasy, Margot, Grandpa Elias said gently. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. He tossed it down the center of the table. It slid past the prime rib and stopped right in front of my father's plate. That's the final signature page of the acquisition transfer. Notice the name of the managing director. My father stared at the paper like it was a live grenade. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the bold ink signature at the bottom. My signature. You knew, my father hissed, looking up at Elias. You knew, and you let me sit here and make a fool of yourself? Elias finished for him. You did that all on your own, Conrad. I just decided I was tired of watching you beat down the only person in this family who actually built something with her own 2 bare hands. Grandpa Elias sat back down, carefully placing his napkin back on his lap. He picked up his spoon and went back to his soup. Isabella was staring at me now. Her perfectly contoured face was a mask of sheer confusion. Wait, you own the company that bought Dad out? But, Duncan, didn't you say that buyout was the only thing keeping Dad's pension fund solvent? Duncan squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Isabella, stop talking. No, I want to understand this, she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. She looked at my father. Dad, you said you made a killing on that sale. You said it was a masterstroke. My father didn't answer her. He was still staring at my signature. The illusion was dead, and sitting in the rubble of it was the most uncomfortable thing I had ever experienced. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt incredibly tired. I looked around the room at the 30 relatives who had spent the last 2 hours treating me like a charity case. None of them could meet my eye. I stood up. I didn't push my chair back aggressively. I just stood, smoothed the front of my dress, and picked up my purse. Happy birthday, Dad, I said quietly. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room. I didn't wait to see if anyone would stop me. I didn't want them to. As I pushed the doors open, the ambient noise of the main restaurant washed over me. Clinking glasses, laughter, a jazz piano playing softly in the corner. It felt like stepping onto another planet. I walked straight through the main dining room, out the front doors, and into the cool evening air. The valet stand was empty, the attendants busy pulling cars around for the after-theater crowd. I stood under the awning, breathing in the scent of rain on hot asphalt, letting the adrenaline slowly drain out of my system. The heavy wooden doors of the steakhouse pushed open behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The heavy, uneven footsteps gave him away. Claire, my father's voice was different now. The bluster was gone, replaced by something brittle and tight. I turned slowly. He was standing under the warm glow of the exterior lights, looking 10 years older than he had 5 minutes ago. How long? He asked. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his slacks. How long what? How long did you know it was my portfolio? From the beginning, I said honestly. The clinics were struggling. The overhead was choking them because the leases you held were structured terribly. You were bleeding them dry to fund your other investments. We targeted the portfolio because the underlying assets were good, but the management was incompetent. He flinched. The word hit him exactly where I knew it would. You targeted me, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You used your little company to humiliate your own father. It's not a little company, Conrad, I said, finally dropping the dad. It's a $60 million holding group, and I didn't target you for revenge. I targeted you because your math was bad. It was just business. He took a step closer, crowding my personal space. I didn't back away. You think you're so smart, he sneered, but there was a tremor of panic underneath it. You think you hold all the cards now, but you don't know the half of it. That buyout, the capital hasn't cleared escrow yet. I know, I said. Standard 90-day holdback pending the final property audits. It's in the contract you signed. You need to waive the holdback. I stared at him. I actually laughed, a short, breathy sound of pure disbelief. Excuse me? You need to waive the 90-day holdback and release the funds immediately. He wasn't asking. He was demanding. Even now, stripped of his power, he couldn't stop trying to dictate reality. Tomorrow morning, I want the wire transfer initiated by 9 a.m. That's not how a a corporate acquisition works, and you know it. We don't release the escrow until our auditors verify that the properties are clean. No hidden liens, no undisclosed structural damage, no toxic waste in the ground. The properties are fine. He snapped, looking frantically over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. But I need the liquidity now, Claire. I need it tomorrow. I looked at him closely, the sweat beading on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hands. This wasn't just ego anymore. This was desperation. Before I could ask him what he had done, the heavy steakhouse doors swung open again. Duncan practically stumbled out into the damp air. His tie was loosened, and he looked like he was about to physically be sick in the decorative planter. He saw my father and stopped dead in his tracks. "Conrad," Duncan said, his voice cracking. "Tell me you didn't do it." My father's face turned to stone. "Shut up, Duncan. We're handling this privately." "Handling what?" I asked, looking between the two of them. Duncan ignored my father and looked directly at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot. "Claire, the buyout funds. Are they secured in escrow?" "Yes," I said slowly. "Why?" "Because your father," Duncan swallowed hard, pointing a shaking finger at the man who had just spent 2 hours belittling me, "used the anticipated payout from your company to secure a bridge loan from my hedge fund. A bridge loan he explicitly guaranteed would be repaid last Friday." I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. A bridge loan? For what? Duncan let out a miserable, hollow laugh. "To cover the margin calls on his real estate developments, the ones that went belly up 6 months ago. He's been using my fund to plug the holes in his sinking ship." I looked at my father. He refused to meet my eyes, glaring furiously out at the street. "If that money doesn't clear escrow tomorrow," Duncan said, his voice dropping to a horrifyingly calm register, "my partners are going to flag the delinquency. When they look closely at the collateral, when they see that I authorized a loan based on an unfinalized corporate buyout from my own father-in-law." Duncan stopped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Fraud, nepotism, the SEC would strip him of his licenses before the end of the month, and his partners would sue him into oblivion. "Wave the hold back, Claire," my father said. His voice was suddenly very quiet. "Just make a call. Tell your people the properties are clean. Release the funds. We can fix this quietly." My phone buzzed in my purse. The vibration felt unnaturally loud in the tense silence. I unclasped my bag, pulled out the phone, and looked at the screen. It was Silas Strand, my chief financial officer. I didn't answer it. I let it ring, the screen illuminating the dark pavement beneath our feet. Silas never called me on a Sunday night unless the sky was falling. "Answer it," my father demanded, stepping toward me. "Tell him to release the wire." I swiped the screen to accept the call and lifted the phone to my ear. "Silas, it's Sunday." "I know." Silas's voice came through the speaker, tight and professional, devoid of his usual dry humor. "I'm looking at the preliminary audit reports for the Voss Medical Group properties, the ones your father's trust held." "Okay, what am I looking at?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the sound of Silas flipping through physical paperwork. "3 of the primary clinic locations," Silas said slowly, "the ones in the high-density zoning districts. He doesn't own the land, Claire." I frowned, glancing at my father. "What do you mean he doesn't own the land?" "They were deeded as commercial real estate assets in the disclosure. They're forged," Silas said bluntly. "He leased the land on a 99-year ground lease from a private shell company, then used the physical buildings as collateral to take out second mortgages. We just ran the title searches. The shell company holding the ground leases just defaulted on their taxes. The county is moving to seize the properties." I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. "If the county seizes the properties," I said, forcing my voice to remain perfectly level so the 2 men standing in front of me wouldn't know the exact nature of the impact, "our acquisition of those buildings is nullified." "Worse," Silas corrected. "Because we signed the assumption of debt clause in the buyout, if the county forecloses on the land, Whitfield Partners is legally on the hook for the second mortgages your father took out on the buildings." "How much?" $12 million, Silas said. "Payable immediately upon default." I lowered the phone slightly. The rain was starting to come down harder now, cold drops hitting my bare shoulders. I looked at my father. He was watching me, his jaw set in a hard, defiant line. He still thought he was in control. He still thought he could bully his way out of the corner he had painted himself into. I put the phone back to my ear. "Silas, freeze the escrow account. Do not release a single cent." "Done," Silas said, the rapid clacking of his mechanical keyboard echoing through the earpiece. "Authorization protocols are scrubbed. Nothing moves out of that escrow account without my physical security key and your biometric approval." "But Claire," he hesitated, a rare break in his usually unflappable demeanor. "The county tax assessor's office opens at 8 a.m. tomorrow. If they file the public notice of default on that land, it hits the commercial registry. Our investors get automated alerts for any liens attached to Whitfield assets. By noon tomorrow, your board is going to know you just absorbed a $12 million fraudulent liability." "I'll handle the board," I said, though my stomach felt like it was filling with lead. "Just keep the money locked down. Send the forged deed files to my inbox." I ended the call and slid the phone back into my purse. The rain had intensified, soaking the shoulders of my dress, pasting my hair to my neck. I didn't feel the cold. I was looking at my father, who was standing under the awning with his arms crossed, still trying to project an aura of untouchable authority. "What did you just do?" my father demanded, taking a step out into the rain. "I told you to wave the hold back, Claire. You do not have the authority to freeze those funds." "Actually, Conrad, I have sole authority," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the passing traffic. "You don't own the land under the Voss Medical Group clinics. You leased it from a shell company, forged the deeds, and used the buildings to take out $12 million in second mortgages." Duncan let out a a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stumbled backward until his shoulders hit the brick wall of the steakhouse. His hands gripped his hair, pulling it tight. You forged the deeds? Conrad, you told me the collateral was free and clear. It is a temporary liquidity issue. My father barked, though his voice cracked on the final syllable. He pointed his finger at me. The shell company is a standard tax vehicle. I was going to pay the property taxes out of the escrow funds once they cleared. It's a closed loop. No one gets hurt. The tax default already triggered, I told him, watching the remaining color drain from his face. The county is seizing the land, which means Whitfield Partners is legally on the hook for the $12 million you stole because we signed the assumption of debt clause in your garbage portfolio. You didn't just defraud Duncan's hedge fund. You committed federal wire fraud to sell me a poisoned asset. I am your father, he roared, lunging forward. He didn't hit me, but he stopped inches from my face, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and raw panic. You will not speak to me like some corporate auditor. You are going to go home, you are going to call your CFO, and you are going to wire that money, or so help me God, or what? I didn't blink. I didn't back away. You'll cut me out of the will? You already did that. You'll humiliate me in front of the family? You spent the last 2 hours doing exactly that. You have absolutely nothing left to threaten me with. The heavy oak doors swung open again. Isabella stood in the threshold. The warm, golden light of the restaurant spilled out around her. She was holding her designer clutched tightly in both hands, her eyes darting between her husband, who was sliding down the brick wall to sit on the wet pavement, and our father, who looked like he was about to have a coronary. What is going on out here? Isabella asked, her voice trembling. Mom is asking where everyone went. Grandpa Elias is just sitting there drinking his coffee and, Duncan, why are you on the ground? You're ruining your suit. Duncan looked up at his wife. His eyes were completely hollow. We're bankrupt. Izzy. Isabella froze. She let out a small, nervous laugh. What? Don't be dramatic. Get up. I authorized a bridge loan from the fund to your father, Duncan said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. $20 million. Unsecured, he used fraudulent collateral. The fund is going to collapse by Wednesday. The SEC will freeze our personal accounts by Friday. We're going to lose the house. We're going to lose everything. Isabella stared at him, unable to process the words. She slowly turned her head to look at our father. Dad, what is he talking about? You said the Voss deal was going to double our trust payouts this quarter. It's a misunderstanding, my father said quickly, stepping away from me and moving toward Isabella. His tone instantly shifted back to the soothing, paternal cadence he always used with her. Duncan is overreacting. Claire's accountants made a clerical error with the escrow release. That's all this is. It's not a clerical error, Isabella, I said. My father whipped his head around, his eyes silently begging me to shut up. I ignored him. Dad set up a shell company to hide the fact that he didn't own the land under his clinics, I told her. Then he took out illegal mortgages on those properties. The county just defaulted the shell company for unpaid taxes. Isabella's perfectly manicured hand went to her throat. She looked at me, then at Duncan, then at our father. But instead of anger, a deep, creeping terror washed over her face. A shell company? She whispered. Yes, I said. Something called Ashby Enterprises. They held the 99-year ground leases. Isabella let out a sharp, choked sound. She took a step back from our father as if he had just caught fire. Izzy, sweetheart, listen to me, my father started, reaching his hand out toward her. Don't touch me, Isabella shrieked, swatting his hand away. Her voice echoed loudly down the wet street, causing a passing couple under an umbrella to stop and stare. You used Ashby? You told me Ashby was just a holding account for my inheritance tax. The silence returned, heavier and colder than before. I looked at my sister. The pieces snapped together in my mind with sickening clarity. Isabella, are you the registered agent for Ashby Enterprises? She burst into tears. It wasn't the delicate, pretty crying she usually employed to get her way. It was an ugly, heavy sobbing. Her mascara ran down her cheeks in dark tracks. He told me to sign the incorporation papers 3 years ago. He said it was just a tax shelter for the estate. I didn't know what it was doing. Oh my God, Duncan whispered from the pavement, burying his face in his hands. You made her the shadow director. You put your own daughter on the hook for the forged leases. My father stood in the rain, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. He looked at Isabella crying. He looked at Duncan rocking on the pavement. And finally, he looked at me. There was no apology in his eyes. There was only calculation. He was already trying to find a new angle, a new victim, a new way out. I turned around and walked away. Claire, my father shouted after me. You can't just leave. You have to fix this. I kept walking. I reached my car parked half a block down, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. I locked the doors, turned on the engine, and cranked the heat to dry my soaking clothes. Through the windshield, obscured by the rhythmic wiping of the blades, I watched them under the awning. A ruined hedge fund manager, a sobbing socialite, and a con man realizing he had finally run out of runway. I put the car in drive and pulled out into the slick city streets. The drive home was a blur of neon lights and rain-slicked asphalt. I didn't go to my apartment. I drove straight to the Whitfield Partners corporate office in the industrial district. I swiped my keycard at the security gate at 11:45 p.m. The massive, renovated warehouse was completely dark, save for the emergency exit signs and a single light burning on the 3rd floor. I took the elevator up and walked down the glass-walled corridor. The smell of stale coffee and dry erase markers hit me, a familiar, grounding scent. Silas was sitting at the massive conference table. He hadn't bothered to turn on the overhead lights. He was working entirely by the glow of his dual monitors. Spread out across across the mahogany table were dozens of legal folders, property deeds, and tax records. He looked up as I walked in. He took in my wet dress, my ruined shoes, and the exhaustion radiating off me. He didn't ask how the birthday dinner went. I called Pierce, Silas said, pushing his heavy black frames up the bridge of his nose. He's on his way. Pierce Halvorson was our general counsel. He was a former corporate prosecutor who charged $800 an hour and was worth every single penny. If Silas had woken him up on a Sunday night, the math was worse than I thought. I pulled up a chair opposite Silas and stared at the mess of papers. How bad is the exposure? Silas turned one of his monitors toward me. It displayed a sprawling flowchart mapping the financial structures of my father's trusts. It's a contagion, Silas said bluntly. Your father didn't just forge the deeds for the Voss clinics. He cross-collateralized the fraudulent loans against the operational revenue of the clinics themselves. When we bought the portfolio, we absorbed the operational accounts, meaning the $12 million liability isn't siloed, a deep voice said from the doorway. I turned. Pierce Halvorson stood there, wearing a wrinkled trench coat over a pair of sweatpants and a Yale sweatshirt. He looked like he had been dragged out of bed, but his eyes were razor sharp. He walked into the room, tossed his wet coat over a chair, and dropped a thick legal pad on the table, meaning, Pierce continued, pulling out a chair, that when the county defaults Ashby Enterprises tomorrow morning, the creditors holding the second mortgages won't just seize the land. They have a legal right to drain the operational accounts of Whitfield Partners to satisfy the debt. I stared at him. They can access our primary corporate funds? Because of the way the acquisition was drafted. Yes, Pierce said, uncapping a pen. Your father structured the sale brilliantly, I have to give him that. He built a trap, and we walked right into it. He knew the tax default was coming. He sold you the portfolio specifically to make Whitfield Partners the financial backstop for his fraud. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. Can we stop the creditors from accessing the accounts? Only if we freeze all Whitfield assets, Silas answered quietly. Which means we can't make payroll on Friday for the 800 employees working in our 24 clinics. We can't pay the medical suppliers. The entire company grinds to a halt. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the rain hitting the streetlights in the empty parking lot. 5 years of sleeping in kennels, of negotiating leases, of building something real and sustainable. All of it was about to be ripped apart because I let my guard down around the man who spent his life telling me I was worthless. What are my options, Pierce? I asked without turning around. I heard the sound of Pierce tapping his pen against the legal pad. You have two, Pierce said. The clinical detachment in his voice was chilling. Option 1, you pay the $12 million to the county tax assessor tomorrow morning before they file the public default. We drain our cash reserves, we take a massive loss for the quarter, and you spend the next 2 years trying to explain to the board why you authorized a payout for an undisclosed liability. I can't do that, I said, turning back to the table. Our expansion capital is tied up in the Voss buyout. If I pull $12 million from the reserves, we breach our own financial covenants with the bank. They'll recall our primary loans, which leaves option 2, Pierce said softly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. We go on the offensive. We file an emergency injunction at 8 Doko Am in federal court. We submit the forged deeds, the fake lease agreements, and the internal communications proving malicious intent. We legally void the acquisition contract on the grounds of criminal fraud. Will that protect the company? I asked. Completely, Pierce nodded. It severs Whitfield Partners from the liability entirely. The debt snaps back to the original trust holders. Silas wasn't looking at me. He was staring intensely at his keyboard. What aren't you saying, Pierce? I asked, my voice dropping. Pierce stopped tapping his pen. If we file that injunction, we are formally presenting evidence of a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme to a federal judge. It triggers a mandatory Department of Justice investigation. Pierce looked me dead in the eye. If you choose option 2, Claire, your father is going to federal prison. And because Ashby Enterprises is the vehicle he used to commit the fraud, the DOJ will indict the registered agent of that company as a co-conspirator. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the rain lashing against the thick glass of the warehouse windows. Isabella, I whispered. Yes, Pierce said. Your sister will be facing the exact same federal charges as your father. She signed the incorporation documents. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense for tax fraud on this scale. They will both be indicted. I walked slowly back to the conference table and gripped the back of my chair. My knuckles turned white. I need you to understand the timeline here, Claire, Pierce pressed, his voice devoid of sympathy. He was a lawyer doing his job. The county office opens in 8 hours. We either wire them $12 million we don't have, bankrupting your company and destroying everything you've built, or we file the injunction, save your business, and send your father and your sister to a federal penitentiary. I stared at the black ink on Pierce's legal pad. The words were blurred, the fluorescent light of the warehouse humming a low, steady drone that matched the throbbing behind my temples. My sister in a federal penitentiary. The phrase didn't even sound real. It sounded like dialogue from a bad television show, but the sheer volume of paperwork spread across the mahogany table was completely real. The $12 million liability was real. The ticking clock was real. Draft the injunction, I said. Silas stopped typing. His hands hovered over the mechanical keys. He looked up at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Claire, once Pierce files this with the clerk at 8 o'clock, there is no undo button. It becomes a matter of public record. The DOJ will open an inquiry by tomorrow afternoon. I heard him, Silas, I said, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Draft it. Pierce didn't offer any sympathetic platitudes. He just nodded, pulled his left laptop from his leather messenger bag and flipped it open. I'll need the original acquisition contracts, the emails between your father's broker and our team, and the title search reports proving the ground leases were obscured. I'll have the brief finished by 4 Delello am. You have everything in the shared drive, Silas told him, his tone clipped. I turned away from the table. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. I walked back toward the glass doors of the conference room. Where are you going? Silas called out. We need your signature on the affidavits before I can authorize Pierce to file. I'll be back before dawn, I said without looking back. I have to tell her. Pierce's voice stopped me with the force of a physical wall. Absolutely not. Claire, listen to me very carefully. You are about to become a material witness in a federal fraud investigation. If you go to your sister's house right now and warn her about a pending injunction, a prosecutor could easily argue that you are aiding and abetting her in destroying evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction. She doesn't even know what a registered agent is. Pierce, I snapped, spinning around to face him. She thought she was signing tax shelter documents. She's not going to shred evidence. She's probably sitting on her bathroom floor hyperventilating. It doesn't matter what she knows, Pierce said evenly, his fingers already flying across his keyboard. It matters how it looks on a federal docket. If you tip them off, you jeopardize the entire injunction. You put Whitfield Partners right back in the blast radius. I stood in the doorway, my wet dress clinging uncomfortably to my legs. The logical part of my brain, the part that had built a $60 million company from nothing, knew he was right. I couldn't risk the company. I couldn't risk my employees' livelihoods just to give Isabella a 4-hour head start on a nightmare she couldn't escape anyway. My phone vibrated in my hand. I looked down at the screen. It wasn't Isabella. It wasn't my father. It was a text message from Grandpa Elias. Come to the house. Come alone. I stared at the text. Grandpa Elias never texted. He despised smartphones. He usually had my mother or one of his assistants place calls for him. Claire? Silas asked, noticing the shift in my posture. What is it? Nothing, I lied, slipping the phone into my pocket. You're right, Pierce. I won't go to Isabella's. I'm going to go home, change into dry clothes, and come back to sign the affidavits. Just get it drafted. I left the office before either of them could argue. The rain was coming down in thick gray sheets as I drove across town to the affluent suburb of Oakbrook. The streets were completely empty. The digital clock on my dashboard read 1:15 a.m. Grandpa Elias lived in a sprawling, mid-century modern estate at the end of a private cul-de-sac. The house was usually pitch black by 9 o'clock, but tonight, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of his ground-floor study were blazing with warm, yellow light. I parked my car in the circular driveway and walked up the stone steps. The heavy mahogany front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the slate-tiled foyer. The house smelled exactly as it always had, a mixture of lemon oil, old paper, and expensive hype tobacco. In the study, Claire, Elias's voice called out. It didn't waver. It sounded just as strong and authoritative as it had at the steakhouse. I walked down the long hallway and turned into the study. Elias was sitting behind his massive teak desk. He was still wearing the tailored suit from the dinner, though he had discarded the tie. A crystal tumbler of amber liquid sat on a leather coaster to his right. Laid out perfectly in the center of his desk was a thick, manila folder. You look terrible, he said, gesturing to my damp hair and ruined dress. Sit down. I didn't sit. I walked over to the edge of the desk and looked at him. How did you know about Ashby Enterprises? Elias took a slow sip from his tumbler. He didn't look surprised by the question. I know everything that happens with the family's money, Claire. I built the trusts. I structured the original wealth. Conrad is an arrogant fool, but he's a predictable one. When he started bleeding cash on those commercial developments 2 years ago, I had my people audit his accounts quietly. I watched him set up the shell company. I watched him forge the ground leases. My jaw tightened. You watched him do it? You knew he was defrauding the county, and you just let him? It wasn't my money he was risking, Elias said, placing the glass back on the coaster. He was drowning. I wanted to see how far he would go before he hit the bottom. He dragged Isabella into it, I said, my voice rising. He made her the registered agent. She's going to go to federal prison, Grandpa. And you knew? Isabella is a grown woman who signs legal documents without reading them because she's too busy picking out upholstery for her yacht, Elias said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. It is a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. I stared at the man sitting across from me. For my entire life, I had thought of Elias as the quiet, stoic patriarch, the one person in the family who didn't actively participate in my father's cruelties. Tonight, at the restaurant, I actually thought he was defending me. I thought he was finally standing up for the daughter who had been treated like a joke. I was an idiot. Why did you blow it up tonight? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. If you've known for 2 years, why wait until the dinner? Why do it in front of 30 people? Elias leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands over his stomach. Because I also knew that the county tax assessor triggered the default on the Ashby properties on Friday afternoon. The notice goes public tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. A cold chill swept through my body, completely unrelated to the wet clothes I was wearing. You timed it. You knew the default was coming tomorrow. You waited until the night before to humiliate him. I waited until the night before, Elias corrected smoothly, because I knew it would force your hand. I knew you would have to freeze the escrow. I knew Duncan's hedge fund would collapse without that bridge loan repaid. And I knew you would be standing in my study at 1 a.m, looking for a way out. He reached forward and tapped the manila folder sitting on his desk. What is that? I asked, though I had a sickening feeling I already knew. It's a cashier's check for $12 million, Elias said, drawn from my private holding account, made payable to the county tax assessor's realtor's office. It will clear the default on the Ashby properties immediately. It stops the foreclosure. It protects Whitfield Partners from assuming the debt. It keeps Conrad out of prison, and it keeps your sister from being indicted by the Department of Justice. I looked at the folder, then back up at him. You're just giving me $12 million? Elias actually smiled. It was a terrifying expression. Nothing in this world is free, Claire. You of all people should know that by now. He opened a drawer on his desk, pulled out a heavily stapled legal document, and placed it next to the folder. I am purchasing 51% of Whitfield Partners, effective immediately. You retain a minority stake and your title is CEO, but I control the board. I own the company. The room spun slightly. I gripped the back of the leather guest chair to steady myself. He didn't just want to control my father. He wanted to own what I had built. He looked at my company, the clinics, the staff, the revenue streams I had bled for over 5 years, and he saw an asset to be acquired for pennies on the dollar. He was using my sister's impending federal indictment as leverage to force a hostile takeover. You're out of your mind, I whispered. I am a businessman, Elias said calmly, just like you claim to be. You built a solid foundation, Claire, I'll admit that, but you lack the ruthlessness required to scale it properly. You operate on sentiment. You hire failing veterinarians and give them equity instead of liquidating their assets. It's inefficient. With my capital and my oversight, Whitfield Partners can quadruple in value in 36 months. And if I refuse, I asked. If you refuse, I put the check back in my safe, Elias said, leaning forward. Tomorrow morning, the county defaults the properties. Your lawyers will undoubtedly file an injunction to sever your liability, which will trigger the DOJ investigation. Your father will be indicted. Isabella will be indicted. Duncan's fund will collapse, and he will likely face SEC charges. The family will be completely destroyed, and their ruin will be a matter of public record. All because you were too stubborn to give up control. He was trapping me in a box with no exits. You would let your own granddaughter go to prison just to steal my company? I asked, my voice shaking with a rage so pure it felt like it was burning my throat. I am offering to save her, Elias countered softly. You are the one who has to decide what her freedom is worth. I looked at the legal document sitting on his desk, the equity transfer agreement. It was already drafted. He had his lawyers prepare this days ago. He had planned this entire night down to the minute. The humiliation at the dinner, the revelation of the buyout, the timing of the tax default. He had orchestrated a perfectly engineered crisis just to corner me. I need a pen, I said. Elias's smile widened a fraction of an inch. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a heavy gold Montblanc fountain pen, and placed it on top of the contract. A wise decision, Claire. It is better to have 49% of a thriving empire than 100% of a company drowning in federal subpoenas. I picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. I stared down at the signature line on the last page. All I had to do was sign my name, take the check, and the immediate nightmare would be over. Isabella wouldn't go to prison. My employees would get paid. The company would survive. But it wouldn't be my company anymore. It would be his. And I would spend the rest of my life working for a man who had manipulated my entire family like pieces on a chessboard. I uncapped the pen. I placed the nib against the thick paper, and then I stopped. I looked at the name of Elias's holding company printed at the top of the equity transfer agreement. Kellner Capital Management. A memory sparked in the back of my mind. Something Silas had mentioned in passing 6 months ago when we were first analyzing the market for potential acquisitions. We had looked at a chain of failing veterinary suppliers in the Midwest. They were heavily indebted to a private equity firm that was aggressively liquidating their assets. I slowly lifted the pen off the paper. Kellner Capital Management. Yes, Elias said, watching me closely. Sign the document, Claire. Kellner Capital Management. I repeated, my mind racing to connect the dots. You own the majority stake in the supply chain vendors that service the Voss Medical Group clinics. Elias's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. My father's clinics, I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a freight train. The ones he drove into the ground because the overhead was too high. The overhead was high because the supply contracts were exorbitant. He was locked into exclusive vendor agreements with Kellner Capital. I dropped the pen onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the wood. You didn't just watch him drown, Grandpa, I said, staring at him with a mixture of horror and awe. You held his head under the water. You used your supply companies to bleed his clinics dry, forcing him to take out those fraudulent second mortgages just to keep the doors open. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't deny it. He just looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. Business is an ecosystem, Claire. The weak are consumed to nourish the strong. Conrad was weak, and now you want to consume me, I said, stepping back from the desk. You engineered this entire crisis so you could buy my father's real estate portfolio through me, effectively washing the fraudulent debt through Whitfield Partners. You have a vivid imagination, Elias said, his voice hardened, but it doesn't change your current reality. You need $12 million by 8 o'clock this morning. Sign the paper. No, the word hung in the air between us. Absolute and final. Elias stood up slowly. Do not be a fool, Claire. I am offering you the only lifeline you have left. You're offering me a collar, I said, turning toward the door. I spent 5 years sleeping on concrete floors, so I would never have to take orders from anyone in this family again. I'm not signing my company over to you. If you walk out that door, Elias called after me, his voice echoing in the large study, I will not offer this deal again. I will let the county seize the properties. I will let your father hang. I will let Isabella be indicted. And I will personally ensure that Duncan's hedge fund is liquidated to pay back every cent he owes his investors. I stopped with my hand on the brass doorknob. I didn't turn around. Do whatever you want, Elias, I said quietly. But if you think I'm going to let you steal what I built to cover up your own predatory lending, you underestimated the wrong granddaughter. I opened the door and walked out of the study, down the long hallway, and out into the storm. By the time I got back to the Whitfield partners' office, it was 3:00 a.m. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, humid mist hanging in the industrial park. I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor. Pierce was asleep in a chair in the corner of the conference room, his head tipped back against the wall, a half-empty cup of coffee resting precariously on his knee. Silas was still at the table, his eyes bloodshot, staring at the dual monitors. He looked up when I walked in. He took one look at my face and sat up straight. "Where did you go?" "To see my grandfather," I said, pulling out a chair and sitting down heavily. I felt like I had aged 10 years in the last 3 hours. Silas frowned. "Why?" "Because he has $12 million in liquid cash, and he offered to pay off the county tax default before 8 o'clock. Pierce woke up with a snort, nearly spilling his coffee. He blinked rapidly, sitting forward. "Elias offered to cover the liability? Are you kidding me? Why?" "In exchange for 51% of Whitfield," I said. Pierce whistled low and long under his breath. "A hostile bailout. That's ruthless. He also owns Kellner Capital," I added, looking at Silas, "the private equity firm that holds the vendor contracts for the Voss clinics. He intentionally bled my father's portfolio dry to force him into default." Silas went completely still. His fingers slowly pulled away from his keyboard. "Kellner Capital. Are you absolutely sure about that, Claire?" I saw the equity transfer agreement. It was printed right at the top. Silas didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at the wall behind me, his mind clearly running through hundreds of spreadsheets and financial disclosures. Then, very slowly, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. It was a terrifying look on a man who usually only cared about pivot tables. "Silas?" I asked. "What is it?" "Kellner Capital," Silas repeated, leaning forward and grabbing his mouse. He started clicking through files at a frantic pace. 3 months ago, when we were doing the initial due diligence on the Voss buyout, I flagged an anomaly in the vendor supply contracts. The pricing was so inflated it looked like a kickback scheme. I asked your father's broker for the ownership disclosures of the vendor companies, but they refused to provide them, citing a confidentiality clause. "Okay," I said, not following his logic. "So what?" "So," Pierce interjected, suddenly wide awake and leaning over the table, "if Elias owns the vendor companies that were price gouging the clinics, and he also structured the original trusts that held the clinic real estate, it's a conflict of interest," I said. "It's vastly more illegal than that," Pierce corrected, standing up. "If Elias intentionally manipulated the operational expenses of a trust he was fiduciary over, in order to force a default so he could acquire the underlying assets, that's a breach of fiduciary duty, market manipulation, and predatory monopolization. It's a massive antitrust violation." "And," Silas added, pulling up a massive PDF on his monitor and spinning it around for us to see, "I kept copies of the vendor contracts. Because I'm paranoid." He pointed to a clause buried on page 42 of the dense legal text. "Look at the termination penalty," Silas said. I leaned in and read the text. My eyes widened. "If the clinics default on their payments, Kellner Capital has the right to place a mechanical lien on the physical properties to recoup the debt." "Exactly," Silas said, slamming his hand on the table. "Elias didn't just want Whitfield Partners tonight. He wanted the buildings. He was using the vendor contracts to establish a secondary claim on the real estate. If the county seized the land tomorrow, Elias was planning to step in and buy the deeds from the county at auction, using the mechanical liens to block any other bidders. He was double-dipping," Pierce said, a tone of professional admiration mixing with utter disgust. "He forced his own son into bankruptcy to steal his real estate, and when you bought the portfolio instead, he pivoted to stealing your entire company." I sat back in my chair. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, hyper-focused adrenaline. "Can we prove it? Can we prove he orchestrated the whole thing?" "We don't have to prove it in a courtroom," Pierce said, a sharp, dangerous edge to his voice. "We just have to prove it to the county tax assessor." I looked at him. "How?" "The county isn't seizing the properties tomorrow because they want to," Pierce explained, pacing the length of the conference room. "They're seizing them because the property taxes haven't been paid in 3 years. They just want their money. If we show the county attorney that the tax default was deliberately orchestrated by a third party, Kellner Capital, as part of an illegal antitrust scheme, the county will immediately halt the foreclosure process to avoid being dragged into a federal racketeering lawsuit. It buys us time," Silas agreed. "If the county halts the foreclosure, the $12 million liability doesn't trigger tomorrow. The escrow funds stay frozen. Whitfield Partners survives the week." "But what about Isabella?" I asked, the reality of my sister's situation still hanging heavy in the room. "If we freeze the foreclosure, my father still committed wire fraud with the mortgages. Isabella is still the registered agent for Ashby Enterprises." Pierce stopped pacing. He looked at me, his expression softening just a fraction. "Claire, we can save your company. We can buy you time to untangle this mess. But we cannot unforge those deeds. Your father took $12 million from a bank using fake collateral. The bank is going to find out. And when they do, they are going to call the FBI. Unless the bank is paid back," I said slowly. Pierce frowned. "We just established we don't have $12 million in liquid capital." "We don't," I said, standing up and looking at the flowchart of trusts on Silas's monitor. "But Duncan does." Silas adjusted his glasses. "Duncan? Duncan's hedge fund is about to collapse because your father defaulted on the $20 million bridge loan." "Right," I said, my mind finally moving faster than the panic. "Duncan gave my father $20 million. My father used 12 million of it to cover his margin calls on the real estate developments. Where is the other 8 million? Pierce and Silas both stared at me. Your father's personal accounts, Silas said softly. He didn't lose all of it. He parked the remaining 8 million somewhere to hide it from the creditors. And Duncan still has a legally binding promissory note for the full 20 million, I said, looking at Pierce. If Duncan files an emergency freeze on my father's personal assets tomorrow morning, before the SEC freezes Duncan's accounts, Duncan can claw back that 8 million. It's still 4 million short, Pierce pointed out. The bank is owed 12. I'll give Duncan the other 4, I said without hesitation, out of Whitfield's operational reserves. It will hurt us. We'll have to pause all acquisitions for a year, but it won't bankrupt us. Duncan takes the 12 million, quietly pays off the forged mortgages at the bank, and dissolves Ashby Enterprises before the feds ever get a whiff of it. Pierce stared at me, processing the legal gymnastics required to pull it off. You want to divert corporate funds to bail out a failing hedge fund manager so he can secretly pay off a fraudulent bank loan to save your sister from being indicted? Yes, I said. Can you draft the paperwork? Pierce let out a long, slow breath. He walked over to his laptop, closed the injunction brief he had been working on for 3 hours, and opened a blank document. I charge $800 an hour, Claire, Pierce said, typing furiously. For this, I'm billing you $1,000. Bill me too, I said, turning to Silas. I need you to map out the exact location of my father's hidden accounts. I need account numbers, routing numbers, and the names of the holding banks. I'm on it, Silas said, already diving into the data. I walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the faint, bruised purple light of early dawn breaking over the city skyline. It was 4:15 a.m. My phone buzzed in my pocket again. I pulled it out. It was a new text message. Not from Elias, not from my father. It was from Isabella. Claire, please call me. Duncan just left the house. He cleared out his wall safe and took his passport. I don't know where he went. I read the message 3 times. The words didn't change. The harsh white pixels glared back at me, rendering the elaborate, highly illegal plan Pierce was currently drafting completely useless. Pierce, I said, my voice eerily flat. Stop typing. Pierce's fingers froze over the keyboard. He didn't turn around right away. He just let his head drop slightly forward. Please tell me you just received an email saying your father had a sudden fatal heart attack and this is all over. Duncan is gone, I said. Isabella just texted me. He cleared out their home safe, took his passport, and walked out the door. Silas swiveled in his chair so fast the casters squeaked violently against the hardwood. He ran. If he gets on an international flight, he triggers an automatic default clause with his equity partners. They'll assume he absconded with client funds and freeze the entire firm's operational accounts by 9:00 a.m. We won't be able to access the remaining 8 million. The money will be locked in SEC evidence vault for the next 5 years. Flight risk, Pierce muttered, finally turning around and leaning back in his chair. He rubbed his palms aggressively into his eyes. Unbelievable. The man manages $3 billion in institutional capital, and his first instinct is to pack a bug-out bag like a degenerate gambler. He wouldn't go straight to the airport, I said, thinking about Duncan. I had spent the last 7 years watching him operate at family dinners and holiday parties. Duncan was meticulous. He was obsessive about optics and control. He ironed his weekend polo shirts. He wouldn't just vanish without trying to cover his tracks. He needs to delay his partners from finding the fraudulent bridge loan. He has an executive office downtown, the LaSalle building. He's going there first to wipe his physical drives. Silas was already typing, pulling up a new terminal window on his left monitor. Whitfield uses the same commercial property management software as the LaSalle building. Give me 30 seconds. The clacking of his mechanical keyboard filled the silence. Got it. Keycard swipe at the private garage entrance. Duncan entered the building 12 minutes ago. I grabbed my purse from the table. I'm going. Claire, wait. Pierce stood up. You cannot physically restrain him. If you walk in there and try to forcibly stop a man who is actively fleeing federal jurisdiction, you cross a line from corporate maneuvering into criminal interference. I don't need to restrain him, I said, heading for the door. I just need to give him a better option than a non-extradition treaty in a country he can't drink the tap water in. Keep drafting the asset freeze. If I can get him to sign it before he leaves that building, we can still execute the clawback. I took the elevator down to the parking garage and got back into my car. The drive into the loop took less than 15 minutes with the streets completely devoid of traffic. The city felt hollowed out, the towering glass skyscrapers looming overhead like massive tombstones in the gray morning light. I pulled up to the LaSalle building and parked in the loading zone directly in front of the revolving doors. A bored security guard was sitting at the front desk watching a video on his phone. I didn't bother trying to talk my way past him. I walked straight to the executive directory panel, found the suite number for Voss and Kellner Equity, and slipped a crisp $50 bill, one of the few I kept in my glove box for emergencies, to the nighttime custodian who was wheeling a mop bucket out of the service elevator. He swiped me up to the 42nd floor without asking a single question. The elevator doors parted, revealing a sprawling, ultra-modern reception area bathed in the cold blue light of emergency exit signs. The heavy glass doors to Duncan's firm were unlocked. I pushed through them and walked down the main corridor. The thick, plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps. At the very end of the hall, a sliver of warm light spilled out from underneath a heavy oak door. I pushed the door open. Duncan was standing behind his massive marble desk. He was still wearing the trousers and dress shirt from the steakhouse, but his tie was gone and his sleeves were rolled up past his elbows. He had a heavy-duty industrial shredder pulled right up to his chair, and he was violently feeding thick stacks of printed financial financial ledgers into the humming machine. Next to the shredder was a black leather duffel bag, half full of external hard drives and banded stacks of $100 bills. He froze when the door clicked shut behind me. He looked up, his eyes wild and completely bloodshot. "How did you know I was here?" he rasped. His voice sounded like it was being dragged over gravel. "Isabella texted me," I said, staying near the door. I didn't want to corner him. He looked like an animal caught in a snare. "She said you took your passport. She shouldn't have done that," Duncan muttered, looking back down at the papers in his hand. He shoved another stack into the shredder. The machine whined as it chewed through the heavy cardstock. "You shouldn't be here, Claire. You need to leave, right now. You can't get on a plane." "Duncan, watch me," he snapped, grabbing another handful of folders from his desk drawer. "I have a private charter waiting at Gary Airport. It takes off in 2 hours. By the time my partners realize the fund is insolvent, I'll be in the air." "And then what?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You live in a hotel in Dubai for the rest of your life? You leave Isabella to deal with the FBI when they kick your front door in on Thursday morning?" Duncan stopped. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the folders. "Isabella is insulated. My personal accounts are separate from hers. They can't touch her. They can when they realize she's the registered agent for Ashby Enterprises," I said quietly. Duncan squeezed his eyes shut. A shudder racked his entire body. He dropped the folders onto the desk and braced his hands on the marble surface, leaning his weight into it as if his legs could no longer support him. "I didn't know," Duncan whispered, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, Claire, I didn't know he put her name on that shell company. If I had known—" "It doesn't matter what you knew," I told him, stepping further into the office. "It matters what the paper trail says. But we can fix it. Pierce is drafting an emergency asset freeze against my father's personal accounts. We know where he parked the remaining $8 million from the bridge loan. If you sign the authorization, you can claw that money back before the market opens. I will wire you the remaining $4 million from Whitfield's reserves. You pay off the forged mortgages, quietly dissolve the debt, and your fund stays solvent." Duncan slowly lifted his head. He looked at me, but it felt like he was looking right through me. He let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed off the glass walls of his office. "You think it's that simple? You think $4 million from your company fixes this? It covers the margin," I said, my chest tightening at the look of total despair on his face. "It balances the ledger." "You don't understand," Duncan said, shaking his head slowly. He reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a single, heavily redacted legal document. He tossed it across the desk toward me. "Look at the guarantor signature on the bridge loan, Claire." I walked over to the desk and picked up the paper. It was a standard institutional lending agreement. $20 million, transferred from Voss and Kellner Equity to Conrad's private holding trust. I scanned down to the bottom of the page, expecting to see my father's sprawling, arrogant signature. Instead, I saw a familiar, looping cursive script. "Isabella Voss Brennan, Managing Director, Ashby Enterprises." I stared at the blue ink, the blood roaring in my ears. "She guaranteed the loan?" I looked up at him. "Isabella guaranteed a $20 million institutional loan? She doesn't have that kind of capital. How did your underwriting department even approve this?" "They approved it because the collateral was listed as the physical real estate of the Voss Medical Group clinics," Duncan said, his voice dead and hollow. "The land that Ashby Enterprises supposedly owned." I dropped the paper back onto the desk as the full, horrifying picture finally clicked into place. My father didn't just use Ashby to forge the deeds for the county taxes. He used Ashby to secure the hedge fund loan. He had Isabella sign the guarantee, making her legally responsible for the $20 million. "If I stay," Duncan said, looking down at the shredder, "if I try to execute your clawback and accept your $4 million, I still have to explain to my partners why I bypassed standard risk assessment protocols to approve a massive loan to a shell company controlled by my own wife. And when they look closely at Ashby Enterprises, they won't just find the forged ground leases. They'll find the operational kickbacks." My stomach plummeted. "What kickbacks? Where do you think your father has been funneling the operational revenue from the clinics for the last 2 years?" Duncan asked, staring at me with dead eyes. "He wasn't just bleeding them dry paying Kellner Capital's inflated vendor invoices. He was routing 30% of the gross revenue through Ashby Enterprises as a management fee before declaring the clinics insolvent." Duncan reached over and turned off the shredder. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. "He turned Isabella into a money launderer," Duncan whispered, "and I authorized the loan that funded the final phase of it. If I stay, the SEC won't just strip my licenses. The DOJ will indict us both for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and money laundering. We are looking at 20 years in federal prison. Claire, both of us. The only way out is if I am not here when the music stops." He grabbed the black duffel bag and zipped it shut. Before I could say another word, the heavy oak door to the office swung open. I spun around, expecting security. Standing in the doorway, wearing a perfectly tailored navy trench coat and holding a dripping black umbrella, was Garrett Voss, Duncan's senior equity partner. Garrett looked from the shredded paper covering the floor to the duffel bag in Duncan's hand, and finally, to me. "Hello, Claire," Garrett said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. He closed the office door behind him with a soft click. I received an automated alert that Duncan's security keycard was used to access the executive suite at 5 in the morning. Given the state of the market, I thought I should come check on my partner. Garrett walked further into the room, leaning his umbrella against a leather armchair. He looked directly at Duncan, who was frozen in place. "Tell me, Duncan," Garrett asked, a thin, cold smile spreading across his face. "Why are you packing a bag?" Duncan couldn't form a single word. His mouth opened and closed, his face entirely bloodless under the harsh fluorescent lights. He dropped dropped the duffel bag. It hit the thick carpet with a heavy, muffled thud. He's packing a bag because my father stole $20 million from your investors, I said, stepping out of the shadows near the door. Garrett turned his head slowly. He looked at me, taking in my ruined dress and wet hair, before his gaze drifted down to the industrial shredder and the pile of paper ribbons on the floor. He didn't yell. He didn't panic. He just set his umbrella against the wall and walked over to Duncan's desk. Is this true, Duncan? Garrett asked. Duncan nodded once, a jerky, pathetic motion. The collateral was forged. Conrad routed it through a shell company. The money is gone, Garrett. He used it to cover his own margin calls. Garrett picked up the guarantor document I had left on the marble surface. He read it in silence. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the city traffic 42 floors below. Ashby Enterprises, Garrett read aloud. He looked up at Duncan. Your wife's signature is on this. She didn't know, Duncan pleaded, his voice finally returning in a desperate rush. Conrad manipulated her. I didn't know until tonight. If the SEC sees this, the SEC won't be the one seeing it, Garrett interrupted, his voice dropping to a glacial temperature. He reached into his trench coat and pulled out his phone. The FBI will. You bypassed our entire underwriting department to funnel institutional capital to your father-in-law. You are going to wait right here while I call the authorities, Duncan, and then you are going to spend the rest of your life in a cell. He started dialing. If you make that call, your fund is dead by noon, I said. Garrett's thumb hovered over the screen. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. Excuse me? You manage $3 billion in client capital, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady. If the FBI raids this office today, the news hits Bloomberg in an hour. Your limited partners will panic. They will trigger mass withdrawal clauses. Your liquidity will vanish, and the fund will collapse before the weekend. And the $20 million my father stole will be locked in a federal evidence vault for the next 5 years, while the courts untangle the fraud. Garrett lowered the phone slightly. He was a pragmatist. He didn't care about justice. He cared about the math. What are you suggesting, Claire? I'm suggesting you let me get your money back, I said. I reached into my purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed Grandpa Elias's private number. I pressed the speaker icon and set the phone flat on the marble desk, right next to the shredded documents. It rang 3 times. Have you come to your senses, Claire? Elias's voice echoed through the executive office, crisp and arrogant. The clock is ticking. I'm not calling to accept your offer, Elias, I said. I'm calling to introduce you to someone. I'm standing in the LaSalle building with Garrett Voss. He's the senior partner at Duncan's firm. The line went completely silent. Duncan was just about to flee the country because he realized the $20 million bridge loan he gave Dad is backed by forged collateral. I continued, speaking clearly into the microphone. Garrett is holding his phone right now, deciding whether to call the FBI. This is a family matter, Claire, Elias warned, his tone instantly shifting to a low, dangerous register. Do not involve outsiders. Garrett isn't an outsider. It's his money, I said. And here is the problem for you, Grandpa. If Garrett calls the FBI, they investigate the shell company my father used to secure the loan, Ashby Enterprises. And when federal auditors look at Ashby's ledgers, they aren't just going to see the forged ground leases. They are going to see the 30% management kickbacks my father routed through that shell company directly to Kellner Capital. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Garrett leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the phone. He was starting to understand exactly what I was doing. You didn't just manipulate the supply contracts for my father's clinics to force a default, I told Elias, the words tasting like ash and victory in my mouth. You actively participated in laundering stolen operational revenue through a shell company. If the DOJ starts pulling threads on Ashby Enterprises, they indict my father, they indict Isabella, and then they walk straight into your study and indict you for federal racketeering and antitrust violations. You have no proof of that, Elias hissed. I have the vendor contracts securely backed up on Whitfield servers, I fired back, and my CFO is currently drafting an affidavit for the county tax assessor detailing your exact ownership structure of Kellner Capital. The silence stretched out. I could almost hear the gears turning in Elias's mind as he desperately searched for a way out of the corner he had built for everyone else. But there were no exits left. What do you want, Claire? Elias finally asked. His voice sounded older. The absolute authority was stripped away, leaving only the brittle reality of an old man who had finally been caught. You have a cashier's check for $12 million sitting on your desk, I said. I want you to shred it. Then I want you to initiate a wire transfer of $20 million from your private holding accounts directly to Voss and Kellner Equity, clearing the bridge loan in full. $20 million? Elias choked out. That is extortion. It's a bailout, I corrected him. You bail out the hedge fund, the debt is quietly dissolved, and Garrett has no reason to involve the authorities. Isabella's name gets wiped from the guarantor sheet. Whitfield Partners doesn't get dragged into a federal investigation, and you get to stay out of prison. I looked at Garrett. He gave me a single brief nod. The market opens in less than 4 hours, Elias. Garrett spoke up, his voice smooth and commanding. If $20 million is not sitting in our primary clearing account by 9 o'clock, I am calling the federal prosecutor's office. You have my word on that. The line was dead quiet for 10 seconds. Then, I heard the faint sound of paper tearing. Elias was ripping up the cashier's check he had tried to use to buy my company. The wire will be initiated within the hour, Elias said. The line clicked dead. I picked up my phone and dropped it back into my purse. Duncan let out a sound that was half a sob and half a laugh. He leaned against the glass wall, burying his face in his hands. Garrett picked up his umbrella. He looked at Duncan, the disgust on his face absolute. Clear out your desk, Duncan. You are stripped stripped of your equity, your licenses, and your title. If I ever see you in this building again, I will have security throw you through the lobby window. Garrett turned to me. The coldness in his eyes faded just a fraction, replaced by something resembling professional respect. You handle leverage well, Claire. If you ever want to sell that company of yours, call me. It's not for sale, I said. Garrett offered a faint smile, turned, and walked out of the office. I didn't stay to watch Duncan pack his things. I didn't have anything left to say to him. I walked out of the suite, took the elevator down to the lobby, and pushed through the revolving doors. The sun was finally breaking over the Chicago skyline, casting a sharp golden light against the steel and glass. The rain had washed the streets completely clean. My father was bankrupt. Duncan's career was over. Grandpa Elias had just bled $20 million to cover up a crime he engineered, and Isabella was going to have to wake up and learn how to live in the real world. I got into my car, started the engine, and turned the heater off. I didn't need it anymore. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, heading back to the industrial district to open my business.